Hi, everyone. You're listening to the podcast of Angelneers, a Silicon Valley community of startup builders where experienced operators share their firsthand knowledge on how to build and scale startups. I'm your host, Oleg Kujakov, and our guest today is Gustav Lindqvist, a former head of data science at both Medium and Spotify. These days, Gustav helps startups figure out how to drive business outcomes with data and analytics. But before we get into that, Gustav, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be on the show.
It's great to have you here for the second time. To let the listeners in a little bit, we had a bit of a technical difficulty our first time recording, and Gustav has been kind enough to give us a second shot, so thanks for coming back. To get us started, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm Gustav Lindqvist. I'm from Sweden originally, hence the accent. But I've been in the San Francisco and the Bay Area now for 7 years. I started off my data science career at Spotify over 10 years ago. And that's how I ended up here in the States. And then I moved over to Medium. And I just recently left Medium to pursue a career as a consultant, helping more companies, especially smaller ones, with getting value out of data.
That's awesome. Two companies that I think a lot of people really like. I know I do personally. But
Thank you.
before we get into that, let's talk about how you got into data science. So you studied math and economics. How did you transition to data science?
Sure. It was actually thanks to my mother. And it wasn't necessarily a super well thought through career move, but out of university, I joined the finance industry, which was okay. Nothing wrong with that, but I wasn't necessarily super happy about it. And my mother found basically a job ad in a classic good old printed newspaper for where they were looking for a role at Spotify. Spotify was starting to take off in Sweden at the time. She thought, this could be something for my son, and so she cut it out, put it in an actual physical letter, and sent it over to me and said, "I think this might be something for you." Turned out that the job itself was actually for something I was not qualified for at all. But I was fortunate that the person I was interviewing with at the time actually saw that, you know what, given your background, we're starting to dabble in this thing that eventually ended up being called data science, and you might be a good fit for it. So then it was sort of, from there on, it was pretty straightforward, I would say.
Well, yeah, I can tell it's an old story because nobody's sending physical cards in the mail anymore.
Definitely not.
Can you tell me a little bit more about like what you were doing as you got to Spotify those early days?
Yeah, sure. I think it was very, as you mentioned, it was early days. So in a way, it was like a golden era because it was just so much greenfield. Getting value out of data was easy in the sense that because you didn't do anything. So everything from the recommendation systems we were building at the time to analysis, just trying to understand how does this thing work. Everything was like revolutionary. So I was lucky to start off, I think, during that era because it was that was definitely very, very easy. Starting doing A/B testing, things that are very straightforward today, but was again revolutionary back in those days.
Sure, and I'll just say thank you. I like my daily recommended playlists. I actually listen to those. So sounds like you actually worked on that. That's awesome. And I think that's a good example of like adding value with data science. But can you tell me some of the other ways data science can actually add value to business?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to there's this term, and data science is this weird term. Everyone has their own definition, and it's so overloaded. But I think there's an amazing term called decision science. I really think data science can be split up into two parts. One is really building data products. So that's that I think that's what typically people think about data science. A recommendation system, I guess, being like the sort of prime example here. And you take data, you apply some sort of quantitative method to it, you get something else out of it, you put it back into the hands of the users, they hopefully react to it, that data is fed back into the this loop, and hopefully over time everything gets better. And that's crucial. Then you have the decision science, which I think is serves the same purpose, which is about making something better. But in this case, it's more about the decisions being made internally at the company. And I don't think there's a single decision that cannot be made better by sort of, again, using data, understanding the world through like rigorous quantitative application of methods that keeps you honest, and then using that as an input to make decisions better than it would have been otherwise. And I think A/B testing is an excellent example of this, which, contrary to popular belief, is definitely not something that is just like, oh, you run a couple of statistical tests and like that. It's really, I think, a process, and like an organizational process, an organizational culture, where data science can play a huge part in like making that very, very diligent. Um, but then it can really be applied to anything, like that methodology again of like just taking data and so on. It's everything from like what things are being purchased, how you make all sorts of other decisions. Yeah.
So yeah, I think the point you're making is that like A/B testing sounds like a test, and tests are very like you take the test and it's final. So we did the test once and that's it. But what you're saying is it's more of a process, more of a relationship. Can you tell me just a little bit more about that A/B testing process at Spotify and how you guys handled that?
Sure, yeah, and I think it's kind of similar, to be honest, at the medium as well, and how it's done at many similar like of these well-known consumer-oriented brands. But I think that the key thing here is really that it's it should really be like called like hypothesis testing. So it's really this like magical loop, or like when you get it working well, is that you do some sort of analysis and then you somehow generate a hypothesis. You test where that hypothesis is right or wrong, and the entire point of the hypothesis is obviously to improve something that's good for the business. um, and then you run an experiment to validate the hypothesis, like true false. But when done correctly, and I think this is really where like the organizational sort of skill sets come in. Uh, any experiment is always going to be successful regardless whether it's positive or not, because if it's possible, well, congratulations, your business metric improved. If it's not, there's always something you can learn from the analysis, and that in itself will help produce these new hypotheses, and that serves as an input back into that process again. And then once you get into that loop, and this is a podcast, so you can't see me doing like circles in the air. But once you get into that loop where like product management, engineering, design, and data science, it works together to just help on producing those hypotheses. If you can just like sort of stay around for long enough, like you're gonna eventually end up with things that help improve your business.
Yeah, like you mentioned, it's a podcast. No one can see what you're doing, but you're sort of moving your hand in a circle. And I'm thinking of those like perpetual motion machines that you just sort of push and then they kind of accelerate themselves.
Totally. And I think that's really what A/B testing is all about. It should be mentioned. I don't know. It needs a rebranding probably, because the point is really to create that machine, like an innovation machine. Sounds very pretentious, but that's really what it is. And a machine, I believe, really like in using that like rigorous scientific method, you can engineer improvement into your business by being diligent about it.
That's awesome. And I love that we get to talk about process on this podcast. I think thanks for like outlining it so clearly. Next, I want to ask like specifics a little bit more. Like, what were some of the most interesting problems you had at Spotify that you were asked to solve?
I think, yeah, first of all, I would say what was very interesting and challenging at Spotify at the same time was the how should we let the implementation, just using technology to try to do data science. That was a different world only even 6-7 years ago, where there were very little open source tools, very little like third party tools you could acquire, like services. I mean, the things today like with AWS and GCP, and like a lot of these things we take for granted like just didn't exist. It was also very expensive to use it. So a lot of my time for Spotify, I think, was definitely characterized by just the technical challenge of even be able to do these things. Um, Business wise, though, I think it was really like generalizing here a bit, of course, and like sort of wrapping up 5 years of work into a couple of one-liners. But I think it was really about helping figuring out what some of those behaviors that actually made Spotify successful amongst the early adopters. How can we take those behaviors and develop and continue to develop the product in a direction where like it can now serve like hundreds of millions of people and create value for them. Because obviously those first couple of hundreds of thousands users even like are not they're going to be very, very, very different from the next couple of tens of millions. And I think being part of the entire product development and business development machinery that data science was, to constantly understand that like we need to develop this product further, and how to use data to understand what we should try, was very, very fascinating and challenging.
Well, you guys did a great job. I know I've already showered you with compliments, but I'll just give you one more. Like, I really love when I finish an album or I finish listening to a playlist that I've made, and then the based on track or the based on playlist comes on. Those are always like so on point, and it's just full of music that I end up really liking, and I end up saving a lot of those songs because Spotify's done such a good job of understanding me as a listener and serving like the content that I really want.
Yeah, well, I think it's and I would say that like obviously it's hard work of many people to get to that magic today, but it's also the result of, again, a very rigorous process to very iteratively and through this innovation machine get to that magic. It wasn't just like one thing and then, oh cool, we nailed it on the first attempt. Very many attempts to get there.
All right. The measure, analyze, improve, and iterate loop, I'm sure, is very familiar to you.
For sure.
So help me understand a little bit better. Like, what kind of metrics are you looking at to understand me as a listener? What kind of numbers were you tracking? How does Spotify look at me and understand, like, how does it quantify me, basically?
I mean, I would say, and I don't think Spotify is necessarily that different than any other company here, or at least on the consumer space. I think it's really the workhorse of all sort of these type of businesses that are have a lot of consumers and are trying to sell them some product that you want repeated usage of out of. It's all about the cohorts. So you take a collection of people who sign up or share some sort of milestone, and then you sort of nail that milestone in time that is down, and you keep on tracking them, and understand how like their journey sort of what the journey looks like, and then you use those insights from what that journey looks like to help and hopefully make the journey for the next cohort even better. That's like so any metrics that has are related to those cohorts around retention, engagement being a volume of some sort of usage, and ultimately conversion to pay. Like, those are the sort of three main ingredients into understanding how you're doing, and more importantly what you're trying to do with whichever product you have, and like, are things improving, is the things we're doing actually working or not.
So, very interesting. I have written down here, data itself is dumb, but then great data sets can represent the fuel for incredible companies. So what does that line mean to you? Data is dumb, and how do you go from dumb data to great data sets?
May- that's not very nice to the data. It's be nice to the data,
We're not
but
very nice to data on this podcast. Sorry, data. We love you.
we love the data. I think it's more like it's there's a tendency, as with a lot of product development, I would say, unfortunately, that you sometimes see, is that you start off with a solution and then you go out and find a problem to throw that solution at. What I've seen, and to be honest, what I myself have been guilty at many times, is they're like, hey, we have all of this data, we can do something with it, let's go and try and find a problem to throw it at. And that is definitely where I think like the application of data can be dumb, let's put it that
Mm-hmm.
way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a great data set, to answer your question, is like typically always comes from like, we actually have a need, and and uh, like you identify the need or the problem you're trying to solve first, and then you work backwards and you're like, hey, what would data look like that could help be part of this solution? And to give you a super concrete example is that, like, if you think about Medium, like tons of written content, and you can describe and annotate that content in like a gazillion different ways. And we instead of, like, you could easily see how you could build up an army of data scientists and people, like you start annotating that data like almost planlessly, and you do sentiment, like you do so many things. But what I'm pretty proud of, one of the works we did was we clearly identified a problem. We at least had a hypothesis that a reader had with respect to what they wanted to know about a story before actually reading it, and then we worked our way backwards from there to help creating a specific part of that taxonomy, the label data, and like be very, very focused on that, and then serve that back to the reader. And I would say that hypothesis then turned out to be correct. But I think that's an example of, like, start with understanding what is it your users need or you think the problem they have, and then go get the data that will help solve that problem instead of starting with the data and going the other way around. And that's when data becomes dumb, when you don't do that, I think.
So stick to the scientific method. Don't skip any steps,
Yes.
or go backwards. Okay, so let's move on. Well, you started talking about Medium.
Mhm.
Can you tell me what your job was there? Like, what was the
Yep.
scope of that? Yeah.
So I ran data science there, and the various projects I worked on, or various I were involved in over the course of those years, were, as I just mentioned, we helped produce and were part of, like, building up again a taxonomy around the content, which you can imagine is useful when you're in the content business to have. It can be so many different things. We also worked on I would say the traditional product analytics, understanding what do people like to read about, how do they like to read, what can we then help to do, make that product, that experience better, working very, very closely with product development in that area, of course, establishing an AB, like, experimentation culture, and also more important, like helping build tooling and education around that. Spent time working on the recommendation system together with the dedicated recommendation team that exists. Also, as is, I think anyone who works with data science can attest, like, there's also just a lot of plumbing work required to make, like, like getting that data structure to work, and also making sure that it's tended to, and so on. um and last but not least, I would say we also definitely spend a lot of time trying to instrument and understanding, like, what is the actual value, or as a proxy measure of the value reading a piece of content actually gives to a reader, and sort of instrumenting that to use that as feedback into a lot of the both recommendation algorithms, but also overall business decisions.
That sounds awesome, and it sounds like pretty similar to maybe what you were doing at Spotify. Can you tell me, like, I mean, you sort of outlined some of the similarities already, but can you just go over quickly, like, some of the similarities and then some of the major differences between the two companies, or at least your experience of, like, data science
Mhm.
between the two? And obviously, you grew at Spotify, the industry grew, and data science itself, it's pretty new. So I'm sure it was different in a lot of ways, but let's hear it from you.
Yeah, I think there were two main differences, as you say, growing up at Spotify versus working at Medium, sort of, or you could say, like, the late aughts and the early tens versus the late tens, working in data science. The first one I mentioned, technology, like, it's just so much more accessible. Like, to be honest, to be somewhat even capable of doing something related to data science early, it was like you needed to more or less be like a software engineer or just knowing how to program. Like that was a necessary necessary evil.
Right,
And
the
also you
plumbing.
needed plumbing, and you needed a lot of just like overall like engineering support to be able to even do the most rudimentary things. That is today like not even a issue anymore. I think it's also just such a dramatic difference in terms of finding the inspiration, where like actually Medium itself, ironically, is a great source of like what are others doing. It's a very interesting field because it's so open by practitioners, by sharing methodologies lesson learned, etc. Which means, and I can just say, trying to build a data science team in Sweden, Stockholm, like that, it was difficult. Like we didn't know, like there were things going on out there in the world, but like where would you find inspiration and the pitfalls? Like we felt like we need to reinvent the wheel many, many times. Whereas now, I believe like you could start a data science team from scratch anywhere in the world, and you could get so many of these hard-earned lessons that have been aggregated across companies. They're now accessible to you. So the tooling, the experience, all of that, like it's available at a scale 10 years later that is just it's wild. That's just a big like more macro observation. I would also say, like in general, even though, like, look, Spotify was super progressive, modern company, I would say, and it was an absolute joy to work there, but it wasn't a given that working in like the value of data science, regardless of whether that was recommendations or like well, any of these outputs we've been talking about, it wasn't a given that was like, of course we want that, and like that's a good way of part of running a company to have that. It definitely like changed, of course, over time, and now, like, it was a long time ago, I think anyone doubted that at Spotify was good. Nowadays, I'd say like different, no one would doubt that. So that has also made, I think, the role of being a data scientist at a company easier. For sure, you feel less of an intruder. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the successes of a lot of these companies with data science have sort of made concrete the value that data science is providing. It was kind of an unknown when you were starting, but now people, I mean, I doubt there's companies out there, modern tech companies, that any of them that aren't doing this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So let's keep talking about Medium. Can you tell me an example of one of the challenges or problems that your team worked on at Medium?
Yeah, so I think the one I already mentioned slightly around the building taxonomy was a very interesting one. It was an interesting one because I think it definitely showcased like how can you like get labeled training data at scale, and also cover that. So
Well, let's talk
and
about data really quick.
of course,
So my limited experience, it's important to understand. You get data, you kind of split it into training and testing data, and labels. Can you just tell me like what even are labels, and do I have that
of course.
all correct?
No, it's good. Yeah, let's use this taxonomy as an example on Medium. It's pretty straightforward example. So you have thousands and thousands of thousands of tens of thousands of billions, maybe. I lost track.
Sure,
Many, many,
if you're
many,
lucky, yeah.
many blog posts written every single day on Medium, right?
Hmm.
And you want a way of putting a label, literally like a text label on like, what is this story about? And to simplify it, let's just pretend that there's two alternatives. There's sports and there's politics, because sometimes when you look at the world, you think that's the only thing that actually exists. But so those would be the two possible values for those labels. Now, of course, what you could do is you could just like manually sift through all of these stories and label them. That would be very boring and tedious, and wouldn't work or be scalable and very expensive. So that's where you would be reading a lot. You wouldn't be doing a lot of other stuff. But yeah, sure, you would be really an expert in sports, and then you put that label.
If you want to skip all that reading, yeah, what would you
Yeah.
do?
So instead, what you can do is you can use a machine learning model to sort of look at the text and then make an educated guess about what should the label be. And I think the key thing here is educated, because where does that education come from? The education comes from having seen a couple of examples of what does a typical sports story look like and what does a typical politics story look like, and using that education, that experience, the machine learning algorithm can then look at new things and infer from its previous experience what should the label be, and make the best guess it can. And I think this is whenever you're building at one of these data products, this is a challenge, because where you get those original labels from, because the machine learning model can't work like it needs to be bootstrapped, like it needs to get that initial data from somewhere. And typically, I mean, I'm grossly simplifying this, but you could say that like what you need is basically high quality training data, which means that it needs to be correct. You can't have any like false positives, sports stories that are actually labeled as politics and so on, because you're going to confuse the algorithm when it wants to learn. And also you need enough examples. You need like fairly big volumes. So, and this is any company's challenge. Like, how do you acquire those training data sets, and how do you acquire them, in a cheap way, but also correct way? And it's tricky. So, I think we built a couple of systems there to, as cheaply and efficiently as possible, gathered at the training data. And I think what was really, really interesting and challenging, or not only challenging, but like a fascinating one, is that is that we worked with a lot of like people who knew content internally at Medium very, very well, because they could tell us like, okay, here are labels we want. Like, this is the type of taxonomy we would want. This is part of our hypothesis we want, that we want to test. How can we find examples of stories to even create those labels? Because it might be very easy to like come up and like tag thousands of examples, sports and politics, but you want broad coverage, so to cover many taxonomies. So we had a very, I think, cool and great internal system, which I'm sure still exists. It's obviously been expanded on by many after me, but that sort of really made sure that we could look at the relevant and the right stories to create these high quality data set, to then train our algorithm to automatically label stories, with the goal of saving as much time and money as possible, and make that as efficient as possible. So that was a very, very interesting problem.
So I'm not sure how if I caught quite how you got the high quality training data sets. Was it manually, like reading through it?
Yeah, it is manually. Yeah, totally. There's humans like, and look, here's the thing with all of this training data, almost like there's no way around it initially, to like, you need to have someone in this case being a human, actually tell the computer like, hey, this is type A, this is type B, this is type C, and so on. Like, go ahead and manual it. I think the difference here between being good and this, as you can imagine, is very expensive and very like tedious, and it's also error prone, because look, humans eventually become lazy and sloppy and like are not very good at it. So there's many like different methods slash tricks you can use to try and make this as efficient as possible, this collection of training data.
Right, and you didn't even mention like articles that have to do with the sport of politics, or politics around sports. That could really be confusing as well.
Now you're getting into it. Like, there's lots of ambiguity and so on, and that's why it's also very important to be working. I think typically when you create these at least taxonomies or labels with domain experts who have a very good idea of what you want to use the output for. Again, starting with the problem. Does it matter that you need to separate the politics of sport, to the sport of politics, or not?
Okay, that's really interesting, and I have a lot to think about after this. But can you tell me, like, so you grew a lot at Spotify. What were some of like the key lessons that were ingrained in you that you brought to Medium from your experience at Spotify? I'm just kind of curious.
Oh wow, that's
Through the retrospective part,
yeah,
huh?
right, exactly. I don't know if my former manager is listening here or not, but well, I think, okay, if we're going to be serious, I think, and
Mhm.
this is uh, very true for data sciences in particular, and now generalizing, but many of us who work in data science would say we are perfectionists, and we are not necessarily we have also a tendency to be somewhat arrogant, and meaning that we think that, like, of course everyone should understand the immense amazing value that we're creating, and they should just be thankful and that we exist, and leave us alone, and we'll get back to you when we're done. I think anyone working in data science, regardless whether it's building a data product or you're in the more analytical space of decision science, um, need, I think, to have adopt a model of, or a modus operandi of understanding that you're serving someone, and you need to think really really crisp about, like, it's all about delivering value. The output is what matters, not the method how you got there. And I think many data scientists saying this because I've done this myself 1,000 times. This mistake of, like, you put too much value in the method and how you get there, and actually it doesn't matter. And I think what I learned, I would say the hard way at Spotify, and hopefully adopted more of that modus operandi medium, is to operate more of an 80-20 rule, and also I would say practice what you preach, in the sense that this hypothesis, try something, learn. That goes for your own process, like get that whatever you're trying to deliver out there, get the feedback, like, is this valuable, like, am I actually creating value, am I actually making these decisions better, and then tweak your own process. I think that's the biggest learning, that to also, like, operate in a data science way.
What do you mean by 80-20 there? I didn't quite
Oh,
catch that.
like, well, I think so the 80-20, like that you only need to. It's kind of like, things doesn't need to be perfect. That 80%, getting something 80% out of the way is typically all you need.
Do you mean like in a technical sense, like if your classifier is like 80% accurate, or am I getting that kind of right?
Yeah, that could be an example. And actually, I think that's typically, and I've seen this especially in recommendation system. I would say it's kind of like, you get very how should we, like, it's not easy. Nothing's easy, but it may be very easy to get, like, recommendations that are like 80% correct, and then there's as much job to go work involved to get something that's like 90% correct, and then it's 10 times that much work to get it from 90 to 95. And then you have to, like, start a question, like, okay, what's the actual business value, and, like, the actual value to your users of getting those last 5%, if that involves like 100 times more? Could there be something else that you could do that you're not doing at all, that gives them much more value? So it's like kind of letting go of that notion that everything needs to be perfect, because to squeeze out those last sort of percentages of perfection is typically very very expensive. And I think this also goes with analysis. I mean, you can sit and analyze things so deeply understand it, but at some point you're getting to that, like, fairly early on. I would say typically when you do analysis of most of these, like, directionally you see where this thing is going, and it might be much more valuable to, like, ship that analysis, even though, like, yeah, you acknowledge I don't understand everything, but this is where directionally how this thing works, and then people can start acting on it. And the sooner they can do that, that's typically more valuable. And yeah, finding that balance between what's good enough, essentially, it's a very challenge, but super super important to get right.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And there's like that human element to these things. Like, it is kind of easy to, when you're passionate about something, to become a perfectionist and want to see things through
Yes.
all the way. But I'll reiterate something I heard on another podcast, which was uh, done and good is better than more done and perfect, right? Because we all got a
For
lot
sure.
of things. We
Exactly the
all
same
got a
thing.
lot of things we're working on, and
Mm.
yeah, it's easy to have a 1 hour task turn into a 2 hour task, and your margin of improvement is not that much. Okay, so last question about Medium. What was the hardest part of your job there, and what was like your biggest accomplishment walking out?
Hardest part, I would say it's one thing that not necessarily the hardest, but one thing that was hard was overall, like, recruiting and building team, finding people. That's challenging. Um, uh, and I would probably say that the thing I would at least say is my greatest accomplishment there, is that I felt that when I left, I left left behind. I guess that's what I did, because I left them. But the team, the ICs that were on that team, I'm very proud. There, that it's a great team we managed to accomplish or get together there, and I felt like medium is in very good hands. Don't worry about medium. I can guarantee you that's a really good data science team. So definitely most proud of that. I'm also proud, that medium is one of these companies I think is trying to do a really good thing, which is bring high quality, good, entertaining content into the hands of the people. Sounds pretentious, and it is, but it's also worthwhile and it's great. And that's a grind. It was 4.5 long years that were many times difficult, and you really needed to play the long game. And I think Medium is on a great mission. Have a great leader in Eb Williams, who's like really good at motivating people internally to like sort of continue on that long journey it is to continue delivering on that, because it's hard, it's difficult. And I'm proud of being, I've played a little bit of a part of help pushing that thing forward, for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome, and kudos to you for setting up that team to succeed. I think what Medium's doing, and well, I won't say. I was going to say Quora, but maybe I don't want to talk about your competition on the
No, that's
podcast.
fine. Core is
Um,
great.
but
Like
I think
Quora.
what they're doing, companies like that, is really leveraging like the most powerful part of the internet, which is like connecting people and people with information that they're looking for. Right. That's the beauty of the internet, is that you know someone with an answer to your question 2,000 miles away can actually get your question, and not just get your question, but answer it, and not just answer it, but answering it in a timely manner. And so what Medium does is kind of an amazing thing. So, man, that's awesome. You've worked at some really cool companies, but today you work with startups. Can you tell me about
Mhm.
like what you're doing with startups today, and yeah, what you're typically brought in to do?
So it doesn't vary so much, to be honest. I think it's really always that way. I mean, it's well, first of all, because these companies tend to be much earlier on in the journey, so the variance is less. But I think it's really about helping them, and a typical thing, and this is not necessarily the most cool, sexy thing out there, but it's really about helping them define and how to measure how they're doing. Some people want to call it like, do we have product market fit, or how, like, what is our product market fit? And I think it's really about really what I can help them with, because I've seen it many times, is like, okay, how do we take this, high level ideas and like what we think we were doing, and actually instrument and actually measure that in an honest way? Because there are many dishonest and slightly misleading ways of doing that, to help us understand, A, how are we doing, and B, most importantly, are we on a trajectory towards doing better? And then the natural sort of follow up after that is okay, cool, how can we start establishing these processes and work internally, like trying out experiments and hypotheses to try and make things better. So that's typically what I do. And then I also, from time to time, depending on the client, go back to, I think a lot of it, which I personally really enjoy, my roots of like actually helping implementing that, building data pipelines, setting up dashboards, writing documents, and like the nuts and bolts of data driven product development.
I mean, yeah, I would call it like the real legwork. You said taking high level concepts and getting them down to the fundamentals. It's great to have ideas, but like actual execution is often the difficult part. You also said like it might not be the sexiest part, and I'm sure a lot of people would agree that like plumbing is not that sexy. But plumbing
Mhm.
took us from you know plumbing has taken us very far. So I think thinking about this stuff at a low level and understanding how those pipelines connect and how this stuff interfaces is like kind of the most important part. Can you just tell me a little bit more about like how you do that, how you set up those pipelines, what you're looking at to harness the power of data?
Sure. So on the technical side, it varies, and to be honest, these days you'd be a fool to like try and build something from scratch, like you would, like there's no reason whatsoever why you wouldn't use like a, cloud like AWS or GCP or Snowflake or something like that to like host your databases and store your data. I think similar to how you like shovel data around, there are so many good like third party and open source tools. So really, a lot of the work I do, and I think what a lot of the work is more like you're basically just you're very good at just taking various components and like duct taping them together. So you're not so much a plumber anymore as you're like a duct taper.
We call that an electrical engineer.
Again, there's so many choices out there today, so it's more about also understanding the client you're working with and like what's their financial constraints, what's I think like what does how can you also build a system, a duct taped system together that can also be owned and operated by other people. So you obviously don't want to go for too many like obscure solutions. As stay with the try and test it. I think on the actual metric side of what you use these systems to actually implement, it's a lot of the work. What I'm trying to do is companies have a vague idea typically about like this is the value we're delivering to our users, and I mean, let's just use a podcast as an example, right? Yes, because now, like, how can we measure whether we are now delivering value to someone? And you can be super naive and go with the easiest thing, like saying like, okay, cool, if someone just starts playing, hit play on the podcast, we've delivered value. I mean, that's a good first step, but probably not great value. We could also be super involved and say, well, okay, we want that person to have listened to the entire podcast, then sent us an email with a very high like positive sentiment score, as well as a voluntary donation. That's the value. Then we know we delivered value. Obviously way too conservative and involved. And I think that the challenge of like any good data scientist or anyone who like works with defining metrics like these, in this case the metric of measuring value, is to find like what's a good middle ground, like what makes sense, and more importantly, I think help articulate and explain, because there's no way you're going to ever get it right. I think that's the first thing you need to let go, that like you cannot measure value perfectly. The only thing you can do is measure a proxy of it. And I think as long as, and that's fine, but you need to have like to be very aware of two things. One, the first one is that it is not perfect, and understand like what are the limitations, what's the good and bad way of doing this, and make sure that other people who use this metric to make decisions understand those. And then second of all, like don't be afraid to say like this is another thing I think like data scientists in general can improve. Like don't be afraid of saying, you know what, we were wrong, or like this was bad, but now we learned something new and we're updating our beliefs and making it better. So like updating and like improving that said metric whenever you learn something new about it.
Yeah, it's really easy to look at failure and see it as a negative. I mean, I say the word failure and I have a negative kind of taste in my mouth. But anytime you're failing, it's really an opportunity to learn, and it's almost as failure is almost as important as the successes sometimes. It's really important to be able to look back and say, we were wrong here, and what did we learn?
Sure.
So you mentioned metrics, and I want to keep talking about
Mhm.
kind of metrics and when you're dealing with startups and startups that sell data products, what are some of like the key performance indicators that you're looking at in those cases?
I think it's again going back to the cohorts. It's all about the cohorts and the curves of the cohorts. Being very specific here, though, there's a couple of things I want to see. Let's talk about retention, for example. It's a straightforward one. So typically, like all companies tends to see like pretty dramatic, and the question also is like, what's good retention? And it's very difficult to like pinpoint a number here. But what I would say is like what's important is to understand what you want to see is you want to see like retention stabilizing for cohorts. So like that this is okay to have an initial drop off. Everyone's going to have that, because let's face it, people are going to try out your product or try listening to your podcast, and like they realize it's not for them. You can't be everything for everyone, and so that's fine. Like that's, I wouldn't worry. But what you do want to see is that the people that do stick around continue to stick around. I think that's one of the things. Another thing I'm typically looking for and want to see is that like retention scales. And with that, what I mean is that like as you grow the sizes of the cohorts, and as you start seeing getting new like channels of acquisitions, you can achieve the same results with respect to retention, so that it's actually your product or whatever the value you're offering to people is relevant for like more and more and more people. That it wasn't that the fact that you had high retention, it's just you found this perfect like small pocket of people who this product was perfect for, but then you exhausted them, and then no one else really cares. That's one of the things. Also, typically another thing you want to look at that's very, I would say, is like engagement over time. So is your product, and this of course, to be honest here, this is a nuance because it depends on what you're doing. Certain like or what you're trying to offer your users. But ideally what you want is to see engagement actually grow over time, which means that the more you use your product, the better it becomes for your users, and hence the value they get out of it increases. That's another like thing to look for. So basically like growing engagement per user in the cohort over time.
Interesting. You don't have to get into specifics, but like how do you measure stuff like that? I'm just curious, like what tools you're using even.
We can totally get into to specifics. And again, I think it's okay. So I have a boring answer because I say like it differs for the company, but I think it really also depends on what you want to do. Is you want to avoid a situation where the tools, like the actual like dashboards tool, like how you explore this data, is becomes bottleneck that like only the data nerds can use them, right? And the data nerds becomes these like gatekeepers to information. That's a very poor way of implementing things. But then the tooling that you choose then to like make this accessible to more people than just the data scientists, I think it really depends on who the people you're working with, and who makes up the company, who needs access to this, like their capabilities. And in certain companies, like you're going to need a pretty sort of easy to use dashboarding solution that is kind of very sort of, it's almost like a pretty white glove treatment. I found like Looker being a great tool there, for example. It's to really like make sure that most people can get to the data and understand it and visualize it. Sometimes you may be working with smaller group that is just like extremely tech savvy and like hands on themselves, and you can build a much more simple implementation this in a Jupyter notebook. That being said, it still requires quite a lot of technical know-how to be able to even access it. So it really, if anyone out there's listening, my advice when it comes to like choosing tools to give access to the data is like really know your audience, really know who the need is, because that's what should dictate that decision.
Yeah, you sound like a man with experience in this. I think, no one, as great a data scientist as I'm sure you are, you're not going to be the only person working on this stuff at the company. So making those tools, easy to use or just usable by different departments and different people working in the company. And so they can leverage it, so they can run with their own ideas is a key approach. So we're talking about data science and how it can be leveraged. Do startups have a chance when competing with Googles and Facebooks of the world, who have data science teams in really high numbers? Do they stand a chance?
Yes, and no, I mean, yeah, for sure. And if you don't try, I mean, if you don't try, then you definitely will never have a chance. So I think that's the case. There are, of course, use cases and certain problems where you're going to be really disadvantaged, and I think those are obviously the ones where like having just insane scale and having insane deep pockets and so on, like gives you an unfair advantage. Like, can you build a self-driving car company from scratch as a startup? Like, that's probably difficult. but there's something to be said, I think, about this. I mean, it's a classical thing, and then you could probably do a series of, you could just do a podcast just dedicated to the topic of like focus, right, and being hyper focused on one problem. And without saying any names, but I would say, like, when I typically look at tools, for example, for data scientists, you can buy tools from like companies that of course like do many things, and then you can buy tools from companies that are hyper focused on one thing. And you can tell like that focus, and this is just my experience, but like that focus definitely shines through, and those tools tends to be slightly better than the ones who this is just one part of their suite. Because let's be honest here, like it never gets that type of attention and research. So there's something to be said for focus, for sure. And again, what I'm seeing, what I in general, is that like competing again with these big guys when it comes to at least like the resources and the technology available to it, yeah, it just becomes easier and easier and easier. That was probably more difficult 5-6 years ago. It was really difficult and expensive to even just store and compute data. But all of that, like it's asymptotically just going to like being easy, I would say.
Cool. So I think you've kind of led into my next question. That's a really good point you make on focused tools being a little, typically a little more powerful. But my next question is like, what are some common pitfalls you've seen by startups when they're trying to apply data science? What are the common errors?
Yeah, I would say one super typical one is to get to like a baseline of what here's a bit they take too long to get to a place where like they can actually, first of all, like identify like what's the metric you're even trying to improve. Like be clear about that, because otherwise you're just running around in circles, and like you're coming up with some solution and then trying to find something. So like starting right then, like figure out like what is the thing we're trying to improve. Then building a system, and building a system here doesn't need to be advanced at all, but it's about like being able to measure that. And then when you do something to try and improve it, like get that feedback loop back where you can actually tell like whether what you did actually had an improvement or not, and then sort of go from there. So getting into that like iteration process of being able to basically measure, and then you do something, and then you observe it again, and you learn from that, and then you do something again, and like that loop. People tend to wait too long to get that loop in place, and they're too obsessed. And I think especially when it comes using recommendations as a place, companies, I've seen many examples like people to spend way too much time like building some sort of first version of a recommendation system, and then they throw it out there, and they're like, okay, did this improve things or not? I don't really know. Instead of just having something super simple based off of heuristics almost, but with a tight feedback loop. That's a very, I would say, classic, typical mistake that you wait too long or you complicate that. Like get the measurement in place and then start doing things.
Okay, that's a good one. Any more, or should we move on?
Should hire more data scientists earlier, but of course I'm talking my own book here. But I think that's the single was one. The other one is, I think, a mistake is also they have it, unfortunately, and I think this is an experience that there are few shortcuts when it comes to like growth and data science. There's this, and to be honest with you, I don't know if there's this myth or if it's even true. It may be true. If any listener knows more, I would love to hear. But like there's this myth that like Facebook figured out that like if you only connect to 11 friends or whatever it is, then you would be retained and more engaged than ever, and that's what's unlocked the amazing growth and potential of Facebook. And I found so many people, like so many says like, hey, I want that number, like that one thing that like triggers everything, and just everything becomes magical. And again, I have no idea, maybe it was that easy as Facebook. I somehow doubt that's the case, but there's you have to understand like the systems you're building, and systems being these products, they tend to be pretty complex, and there's rarely like very simple answers on what to do differently. So there's always this expectation, let's hire someone smart who comes in and like fiddle it with data, and they'll come back and tell us what we'll do, and then we'll get exponential growth. And then that doesn't happen, and they're so disappointed and like, data science, well, I don't know, that's is that science, quote unquote? I think that's another thing. Like expectations are way too high, and it's very, very unrealistic, at least in terms of how much time and work it takes to get to something that's even remotely useful.
Yeah, I think one of the themes that's popping out to me from this conversation is like, data science, we want answers, but a lot of the times the answer is not a pinpoint number. It's like the answer is finding a balance between two different two different things. It's a very human answer to these problems, and people kind of want like that hard number 11, but really it's like, maybe Facebook would have been fine with growth if they use the number 8 or the number 12. Like it's kind of like somewhere in that range is what we're looking for. And again, I'll reiterate your example earlier, like to get from a classifier from like 50% to 80%, that might be really easy based on heuristics. And then you might put in, the same amount of work to get from 80 to 90, and then 10 times the work to go from 90 to 95. And then it's like actually totally impossible to go from 95 to 100. So
Yeah.
finding that balance is the key. And, tight feedback loops promote, improvement. You're going to learn, and you're just going to get better and better as you iterate. So I think we can start wrapping this up with some big picture thoughts. Where do you think the power of data science comes from? And is the answer data? Is it that dumb? Is it the dumb data?
I think, I mean, again, if you split it up, if you think about data products dimension, I think the power there comes from like just building this machine that basically improves itself, which is a very simple yet extremely powerful concept. It's that's almost like you unleash this thing and it works for you. That's beautiful, and that's extremely powerful. It's super difficult to actually build something that does improve itself, but once you have it, like it's magical. When it comes to the decision science, I think the real power and the real reason why it's like the reason for why that discipline even exists and why we should be utilizing as a methodology when building and companies and running businesses is that we humans, as I say, like I would say this: we're not stupid. We're very smart, but we're very lazy and we're very sloppy and we're extremely good at hearing what we want to hear and sort of only reacting to how we already decide we want to react. And what decision science enables us to do is to look at the world in a more sober way and make it way more easy for us to, or so difficult for us to make mistakes, and also make it more difficult for us to sort of cherry pick whatever conclusions we want to cherry pick, because you can, done the right way, serve up more objective truths that you're going to have a hard time sort of navigating around and say. And I think that's really the value. So again, the quality of the choices we make become better through the application of decision science. I think that's really the power of it.
So you might have to repeat yourself for my next question, because I think you might have already answered it. But like, if you had to give a takeaway to business leaders about what they need to know about data science moving forward, what would those key takeaways be for chief executives out there?
I would challenge them or challenge them. They can do whatever they want, but I think the next level. So a lot of companies, like they have a group, they have the data science group, and they operate like somewhere in the company. Think about, what does your company look like, and what's the type of personnel I need, and like what does my, if it becomes natural that everyone's a data scientist, and with that I mean like everyone, regardless what function they operate in, is someone who can think about like, how do I apply like the rigor of decision science to make my decisions better, and also how can anything I build or what I might serve function, like at least try to operate in this data product notion, in the sense that the thing we're building, it improves itself over time the more it's being used. And whether that is marketing, whether that is you're actually manufacturing something, like anything, like, but using those two mindsets and like ingrain them. And also, like, now I'm gonna get a lot of hate mail, but like I would say, like, why should you even be having a data science group? That's kind of like saying like, oh, back in days, like, oh, we have an IT department and they like, they handle they're the ones who like work with computers in this company. Like it's like, I think it should almost be like water, electricity. It should be something that like is everywhere. Everyone, it's natural to operate that way using that thinking. And so, how can you get rid of the data science group, but not their methodologies? I think that's that would be like the next frontier for me.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it gets back to your point of like start with the problem. Really understand the problem before you start bringing in people to solve them. It's hard to, it's hard to bring someone in and just say, do magic, look at our stuff, wave your wand and come up with a magic number for us. That's not typically how things work. So really frame the problem and understand it.
Yes.
Okay. I guess I have one more question about hiring and building a team, which is something you are an expert in. So it's unrealistic to build a data strategy just around hiring the top-notch data scientists. What is the alternative that companies can take?
You're absolutely right. It's like it's unrealistic. Like there's too few really good data scientists around, and also not only good. Like look, there's lots of really good. I've come across like very pretty junior people out there. They're great, but what they lack, and it's not their fault because per definition they're junior and unexperienced. They're going to be great in 5 to 10 years. There's few people who are like experienced and have like learned the hard way how to really like deliver value from data science. And also as a consequence of that, like what is really lacking is like a good like leaders, like managers of data scientists essentially. So lots of strong ICs, but like it's the sort of like middle leadership that's lacking. And that's because if you just look back 10 years ago, there weren't that many people who who did this, and 20 years ago there was literally no one. So like there's very few senior leaders. There's a couple, but like it's just rare, and that will change over time. But in the interim, how do you navigate that? I think it's really about already from day one, because it's so easy. And you asked earlier about like mistakes. Like you try to solve your data science need by just throwing more people at the problem instead of investing in education and tooling and processes for others to do that same type of job. That same type of job being applying rigorous methods to how to measure and understand things. And I think the more you can like turn that into a product almost, you'll be successful. So you should almost hire, like if you go out and hire a head of data science, you should tell her or him that, hey, I want you to come in and I want you to build this structure or like this team or this function in a way that we can just completely remove it in a couple of years' time. Like you should work towards making yourself redundant completely. Then you've been successful. Which probably you need to pitch it slightly differently if you want that person to take that job. But I think that's the gist of it, to be honest.
That's a very interesting take. I think people will love to hear that. Well, thanks, Gustav, for joining us and sharing your experience. That was really interesting for me. Before we go, if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to reach you?
So best way to reach me is Gustav, that's Gustav at datascience-021.com.
All right. So you know where to reach him. He's highly knowledgeable and can probably help with your data problems if you've outlined your problems. So we're going to end it there. If you have any questions, send us an email at info@angelnears.com. Thanks, Gustav, for joining the show today. I hope to have you back on here soon.
Pleasure was all mine. Thank you very much, Alec.
Awesome.